Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. So my name is Xuechen Zhang, and I'm very pleased to present today with my co-author and my supervisor, Associate Professor Hannah Soong.
Thank you, Xuechen. Hello, everyone. I'm Hannah Soong from the School of Education at Adelaide University. If you notice that it's no longer University of South Australia, we have merged with University of Adelaide, and now we're calling ourselves Adelaide University. So first, before we start, I would like to thank Max for inviting us and giving us this wonderful opportunity to share our work together and today with you. So before I begin, we would like to first acknowledge the Ghana First Nation peoples, their eldest, past and present, who are the traditional owners of the land that Xuechen and I are co-presenting in our campus in Adelaide in South Australia. So over to you, Xuechen.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Today's presentation is based on a book chapter I co-authored with Hannah Soong and Michael Moon. So our chapter looks at the Chinese parents' engagement in the IB-NYP internal assessment. The IB stands for the International Baccalaureate, and NYP stands for the Middle Years Program. We use Bourdieu's concepts of the field, capital, and habitus to understand this topic. The title is The Excluded Elite. This title raised a puzzle. How can highly resourceful and education-oriented parents still become marginal in their children's assessment process? So this is the question I will explore today. To begin, I would like to briefly introduce what IB-NYP assessment is, especially for those who may not be very familiar with the IB system. The International Baccalaureate, or IB, offers 4 programs. These are the Primary Years Program, PYP, the Middle Years Program, MYP, the Diploma Program, DP, and the Career-Related Program, CP. Our study focused on the Middle Years Program, MYP, which is designed for the students aged 11 to 16. So in the IB continuum, it sits between the Primary Years Program and the Diploma Program. So MYP assessment has several distinctive features. It is mostly school-based internal assessment, which means the assessment is designed and carried out within the school, rather than being mainly based on the external exams. It is also criterion-related, not rank-based. So students are assessed against specific criteria, rather than simply being compared with each other. Another important feature is that MYP assessment often use the authentic and process-oriented tasks. It assesses not only the final product, but also the learning process. In this system, the teachers play a central role. They design tasks, they gather evidence of student learning, and provide feedback. In many IB schools in China, English is also commonly used as a medium of instruction and assessment. In our study context, a Chinese-English bilingual IB school, some assessment tasks were written in English. So, for parents, understanding MYP assessment could involve not only understanding criteria and feedback, but also navigating the English medium assessment information. This is important for our study because the parent engagement in IB NYP assessment is not simply about knowing the final grade. It requires the parents to understand criteria, feedback, learning process, and student progress. In many IB schools in China, this may also involve navigating the English medium assessment information. So, the meaningful engagement depends not only on parents' willingness to support their children, but also on a specific form of assessment literacy. Building on the previous slide, if MYP assessment requires more than simply knowing grades, then the next question is, how are parents expected to engage in IB assessment? In IB documents, the parents are positioned as the informed partner. This does not mean that parents should mark assessment, design assessment tasks, or replace the teacher's professional judgment. Teachers remain responsible for assessment. Rather, the parents are expected to understand the purpose of assessment, how assessment is applied, and their children's strengths and needs. Schools are also expected to communicate assessment policies and gather feedback from the wider school community, including parents. To understand how this is translated into the school practice, I reviewed assessment policies from 18 IB schools across the Asia, Europe, United States, and Australia, including 6 IB schools in China. These policies show a range of possible practice. Some schools involve parents in assessment policy review or consultation. Others use the parent-teacher conferences, student-led conferences, criteria-based reports, feedback conversations, communication with teachers, or support outside the classroom. So parental engagement in IB assessment does not mean controlling assessment. It means understanding assessment well enough to support learning appropriately. However, existing empirical evidence suggests a gap between expectation and reality. In practice, parents often remain information receivers. They may receive reports or feedback, but have limited engagement in the assessment process itself. More importantly, in the Chinese context, there is still little evidence on how parents engage with MYP internal assessment specifically. This is the gap our study addresses. Because of this limited IB-specific literature, we then turn to the broader literature on Chinese parental engagement to understand what Chinese parents usually value and how they typically support children's education. This broader literature shows several established patterns in the Chinese parental engagement. First, the Chinese parental engagement is often shaped by a strong achievement orientation. Parents are commonly seen and often see themselves as responsible for supporting their children's educational success. The concept of 果然 is useful here. It means more than control. It combines care, guidance, and governance. So, supporting children's education is often understood as part of the parental care and responsible. So, the literature also shows that the family resources and parental education shaped engagement. Resourceful parents are often described as the teachers at home. They may monitor homework, arrange extra learning, invest in tutoring and extracurricular activities, and communicate with schools when needed. So this creates an important tension for our study. Resourceful and education-oriented parents often invest heavily in children's education, but will this translate into the meaningful engagement in the IB MYP assessment? Or can these resourceful parents still become excluded from the assessment process? To understand this tension, we turn to the Bourdieu's concepts of field, capital, and habitus. So in this study, we understand parental engagement not only as an individual choice, but as a practice shaped by the parent's habitus and capital within a specific field, the field of IB-MYP internal assessment. So the habitus refers to the parents' dispositions and ways of understanding education. For these Chinese parents, it was shaped by their own educational experience, especially the exam-oriented schooling, as well as their overseas experience and work environments. Field refers to the assessment space itself. In this field, the teachers occupy a powerful position because they design the task, use assessment criteria, gather evidence, and provide feedback. Parents, by contrast, are often positioned as the information receivers. Capital. Capital helps us understand why willingness is not enough. Economic capital may allow families to enter the IB schooling, but meaningful participation also depends on the cultural capital, such as the IB assessment knowledge and English, and social capital, such as the access to useful networks. So this framework helps us ask, when parents are willing to invest, what forms of capital are actually recognized in the IB assessment field? With this theoretical framework, we examined the interview data from 14 Chinese parents. Methodologically, was a qualitative interview study. We conducted one-on-one semi-structured interviews via WeChat with parents from a Beijing non-state Chinese-English bilingual IB school. The sample included 14 parents from 14 families. Each participant was the primary education supporter of the child, and each child had studied in the MYP at this school for at least 2 years. This was a relatively focused case. The parents were located within the same school, curriculum, and assessment context. They also came from relatively resourceful family and educational backgrounds and showed the willingness to invest in their children's education. At the same time, they had no K-12, IB, or bilingual schooling background in China. This combination is important for our study. It allowed us to examine why parents who were resourceful and willing to invest could still experience limited engagement in the MYP internal assessment. The interviews focused on 2 areas. The first, parents' understanding of the MYP internal assessment, including its features and system. And second, their perceived engagement and the reasons behind it. Before the study, I had worked at the school as an MYP teacher and assessment coordinator. This prior connection helped with the recruitment through the school network. So this slide summarizes the participant profiles, but I will only highlight the points most relevant to our study. Overall, these parents had relatively resourceful educational and professional backgrounds. Most of them had bachelor or master's degree, and many were professionals, leaders in the workplace, or business owners. They were also willing and able to invest in their children's education. They were the primary supporters of their children's schooling, and their family had chose the high-cost bilingual IB education. However, their IB relevant capital was uneven. None had K-12 IB or bilingual schooling experience in China, and their English use and overseas experience were quite different. So, this was not a group of parents who lacked interest or resources. Rather, they were resourceful and willing, but not equally equipped with the forms of capital recognized in the IB MYP assessment field. Now I move to the first finding, which focuses on the access, whether parents could actually see, understand, and enter the MYP internal assessment process. We describe this as the gatekeeping by teachers and children, because the parents' access to assessment information was not automatic. It was often shaped by what teachers explained and what children chose to share. First, the teachers provide limited and unspecific assessment information. The parent Cheng's quotation captures this clearly. The key phrase here is, the assessment was introduced, but not specific. This points to teacher gatekeeping, because the parents did receive some general information, but not enough specific knowledge to understand the assessment task, criteria, or process. Second, the children selectively share assessment-related information. In Parent Dong's quotation, the key phrase is that the child never shared about the assessment-related issue of feelings. This shows the gatekeeping through the children. The parents' access depends heavily on what children chose to share at home. When children did not communicate, the parents had very limited visibility of the assessment process. Third, the parental engagement occurred mainly when it was required or prompted. Parent Yuan explained that parents were required by teachers to offer support during assessment tasks. This suggests that the parental engagement was conditional. Parents did not usually enter the assessment process independently. They became involved mainly when the teachers required their support or when children prompted them to participate. So, overall, this finding shows that these parents were not simply unwilling to engage. Their engagement was constrained by access. In the field of MYP internal assessment, access was largely kept by teachers and children. But access was only the first issue. Even when parents gain some access, they still need the capability to make sense of the assessment information. That leads to the second finding. Hannah, you have muted yourself.
Sorry. Thank you, Xuechen. Now, finding 2 focuses on parental capability, and that is whether parents had the knowledge, the time, and language resources to engage once they gain some access. So in the finding 1, we showed that parents' engagement was constrained by access. But even when parents had some access to assessment information, access did not straight away become a meaningful participation. Parents also needed the capability to understand and respond to that information given to them. So first, parents had limited IB literacy. Young's quote shows this clearly. So she did have communication from the teacher about IB assessment, but the key phrase is, I didn't really understand. She also said that she needed a very long time to digest and absorb the related knowledge. So even though communication was there, it did not guarantee meaningful engagement for a parent like Yang. Parents also needed the knowledge to make sense of this assessment information given to them. And the other reason is language. Language was another constraint. Like Bo's quote here shows this very clearly. He said, I can't understand the assessments written in English. Now, this shows how English medium assessment actually became a practical barrier to engagement. And just to add to that, some parents also talked about time. With long working hours and busy schedules, even when they wanted to support their children, they did not always have the time to follow the assessment process closely. So overall, this finding shows that parental engagement was not only an access issue, it was also a capability issue. These parents were willing to support their children, but they did not always have the assessment literacy, the English resources, or the everyday time needed to participate meaningfully in the MYP assessment field. And next, we talk about parental beliefs about parenting. So finding 3 focuses on the parental educational beliefs and their backgrounds. Now, we divide this finding into 3 parts. First, the belief about parenting, the beliefs about teacher-parent relationships, and the belief about the parents' own educational backgrounds. So together with these 3 parts, which we believe will help explain why resourceful and educated-oriented parents could still see limited engagement as something that is actually reasonable, respectful, and even responsible on their part. Now, the first part concerns about beliefs about parenting to nurture child independence. Now, these parents were not indifferent to education. First, some parents, they respected the children's unwillingness to share the assessment-related information. Like Zhuo's quote captures this clearly. The key phrase is that parental engagement depends on whether the child thinks it is necessary or not. So this means that parents did not see engagement as something they should always initiate. Instead, they believe that children should decide when parental support was needed. In this sense, not entering the assessment process too directly was understood as a form of respect of the child's own judgment. Second, we have parents wanted to cultivate their child's independence and self-motivation. So several parents use the phrase this: study is your own business. So some parents said that they would not check the child's progress too closely because they wanted the child to ask for help independently and develop their own problem-solving skills. Others did not want children to feel that, the parents, that they are constantly controlling or following every step of their work. So this was not simply a hands-off approach, but for these parents, stepping back could be understood as a way to cultivate self-responsibility, independence, and trust. Now, this trust could become a form of over-trust. If parents waited for children to communicate everything and children did not share assessment-related information, therefore the parental engagement became limited and reactive. So here, parental care did not necessarily mean direct intervention. The educational commitment could take the form of stepping back, but this also created space for parents to remain outside the IB assessment process. Now, Xuechen will move on to talk about the second part of this finding 3, about the beliefs, which is concerning teacher and parent relationships, where respect for teachers and respect for teacher authority also shaped their limited engagement. Thanks, Xuechen.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. In this part, the parents' limited engagement was shaped by how they understood the relationship between teacher and parents, and also by their own earlier schooling experience. In other words, the parents were drawing on a familiar educational relationship, the teacher's lead and the parents' support from a distance. First, many parents emphasized respecting teachers' expertise. This was expressed through the appreciating the Chinese traditional beliefs of 尊师重道, which means honoring teachers and respecting their expertise. Because of this belief, some parents did not feel it was appropriate to question teachers' judgment about assessment tasks, grades, or feedback. So, respect for teachers became one reason why parents did not actively challenge or enter the assessment process. Second, the parents tend to let the teachers lead school education. This connects back to the funding 2 about the capability. But here, the focus is on how parents made sense of their limited knowledge. Some parents felt that they only understood part of IB assessment. For example, the parent Moong worried that the parents were not as professional as the school and the teachers. So teachers were positioned as the professionals, where parents positioned themselves as less qualified to get engaged. In this sense, the stepping back could feel like the more appropriate choice. Third, some parents avoid disturbing teachers. In the interviews, this was linked to the idea that teachers already had a heavy workload. The parents did not want to add extra pressure by asking too many questions. Some parents also trusted that the teachers had already shared every student's grades and other necessary details. So, if teachers did not raise an issue, the parents often assumed that the further engagement was not needed. The final point helps explain where these beliefs came from. The parents' earlier schooling shaped what they believed they could or could not do in relation to the school assessment. So Lin's quote captured this clearly. She described her own education as the lecture-based. The key phrase is, "We studied what the teacher told us." She also said that she did not have the perception that she, as a parent, could get engaged in the teaching practice or affect the teacher's practice, such as assignment. So this suggests that the parents were not simply being polite when they stepped back. Their earlier teacher-led schooling experience shaped their sense of what parents could or could not do in relation to the school assessment. So when parents respect teachers, let teachers lead, avoid disturbing them, or assume the teachers had already shared what was needed, these were not separate small points. Together, they reflect a deeper educational habitus. The teachers lead and the parents support from a distance. So taken together, the findings show that the parents' limited engagement was not caused by one single factor. It was shaped by the access, capability, and educational beliefs. So the question now is, how can we explain this theoretically? I will discuss this through two ideas. First, the capital and positioning in the field, and second, habitus mismatch and differences. Our first discussion point is about the capital and the positioning in the field. Our participants were relatively privileged in the broader Chinese social space. Many had strong educational backgrounds, professional status, and economic resources in the broader Chinese context. However, their position changed when they entered the field of IB/NYP internal assessment. In this specific field, they were often positioned as the less powerful than teachers, and even dependent on children for access to assessment information. So this shows that the capital does not travel automatically across the fields. The economic capital allowed the family to enter IB schooling, but it had limited exchange value in the assessment process itself. Being able to pay for the IB education did not mean the parents could understand assessment criteria, feedback, or process. What mattered more was the field-specific cultural and linguistic capital, such as the IB assessment literacy and English, as well as the social capital, such as the access to useful network or access to the people who understood the IB assessment. So the key point is that these parents were privileged in one field, but relatively subordinate in another. This helps explain the idea of the excluded elite. They had resources, but not always the forms of capital recognized in the IB assessment field.
Thanks. The second discussion point is about habitus mismatch and deference. Here we use Bourdieu's idea of hysteresis to understand why parents struggle to make sense of IB assessment. By hysteresis, we mean a time lag between their old dispositions and a new field. So many parents' educational dispositions were shaped by the exam-oriented, teacher-led schooling field. In that earlier field, teachers were seen as the professional authority, and assessment was more closely associated with getting marks, passing the exams, and also based on teacher judgment. But IB/NYP assessment belongs to a different field. It is school-based, criterion-related, process-oriented, and less familiar to these parents. So there was a mismatch between the old educational field that shaped parents' dispositions and the new assessment field that they encountered through their children's schooling. Then this helps explain why some parents needed time to understand IB assessment and why they did not always feel able to enter the assessment process. Now, deference also mattered. As we showed in the finding 3, many parents respected teachers' authority, trusted teacher-led schooling, and avoiding disturbing teachers. These beliefs make stepping back feel reasonable and appropriate. This is why our argument is not simply about a resource story. These parents had resources, but their privilege did not automatically become recognized participation in the IB assessment field. Instead, their Chinese educational habitus shaped how they understood teachers, children, assessment, and their own role as parents. It intensified their positional disadvantage in this specific field. So the limited engagement we observed was not simply a matter of unwillingness. It was produced through a mismatch between the parents' habitus and the rules of the IB NYP assessment field. Then this brings us to the conclusion. What does this tell us about parental engagement, exclusion, and equity in IB assessment?
Okay, to conclude, this study shows that the educational fields often contain the hidden rules. The IB assessment is no exception, even though the IB has strong inclusive ideas. So in the field of the NYP internal assessment, so even resourceful Chinese parents were not fully participants. Their resources and educational commitment did not automatically translate into the meaningful engagement. And across the findings, we show that the parental engagement was shaped by the access, capability, and habitus alignment. The teachers and the children shaped what parents could see and know, and assessment literacy, time, and English shaped what parents could do. The parenting beliefs, respect for teachers, and educational backgrounds shaped the whether stepping back felt reasonable and appropriate. Theoretically, this study shows that the capital and habitus are field-specific. The resources that are powerful in one social space may not be recognized in another. So the key takeaway is this. The excluded elite are excluded not because they lack resources or care, but because the rules of the participation are hidden and field-specific. So making these hidden rules visible is important for the policymakers, school leaders, and educators who want to support more equitable parental engagement in assessment. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions and comments.